Greetings, dear viewers. Today we are talking about a very important topic which affects all of us. Creative Society team includes thousands of active volunteers from 180 countries. Every day we monitor natural disasters, and based on these data, we see considerable changes. Every day we talk to eyewitnesses for occurring cataclysms, and every day we read papers, scientific report, and connect with the scientists to understand what is going on our planet, what causes climate change, and what we are offered is a theory that everything on the planet is driven by CO2.
And if it is so, that what is being offered to us as a solution? To shut down all our manufacturers that produce CO2, to get rid of those jobs, stop eating meat, become vegans, get electric cars, put solar panels on our houses, to stop using current sources of energy, and to invest all our resources and attention into building this so-called green energy, which supposedly would bring us to net zero by 2050. But what it actually means to each one of us? Well, you can see this meme on screen, which pretty exactly gives us a picture of what it could be like. It means to it means that our paychecks will become much smaller. Our expenses to pay for the electricity will become much larger. And we are going to destroy all our resources of energy, existing power grids, and create absolutely unreliable sources of energy. And this is happening during very challenging time for us as a society. So is it really worth it? And can anyone guarantee that it will work?
Today, we are happy to have an opportunity to present you an expert opinion of a recognized scientists and specialists who don't earn money on CO2 affair. It's my honor to introduce you Professor Judith. She is a leading American climatologist, president of Climate Focused Application Network. Prior to that, she was professor and chair of the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences in Georgia Tech. Judith was repeatedly invited to the United States Congress to share her expert opinion on climate change. I would like also to introduce you our Professor Dr. H. Sterling Burnett. He is one of the U.S. leading authorities on energy and environmental issues. Dr. Burnett is a Heartland Senior Fellow on Environmental Policy and the Managing Editor for Environment and Climate Use. Welcome, Dr. Burnett. And it's, of course, my special pleasure to introduce you a scientist whom the most of you already know. Professor Arthur Vitorita is Professor of Geography, and he is also a policy advisor for the Heartland Institute. It's really my honor to be with all of you here. Welcome for our discussion.
Thank you. Welcome. And also today with us, speakers of the Global Crisis Time for the Truth Conference, Dusan from Czech Republic and Elizaveta Chromova, geologist from Moscow.
So, my dear experts, I probably would like to start with a pretty simple and straightforward question. So possibly like Professor Vitorita, you may start. And my question is that what are the main scientific facts which proves that CO2 is a not driving factor for a climate change?
The question has recent additional CO2 loading to the atmosphere from human activities been a significant driver of global temperature rise. And do we have the graph up there? Can we put the graph on my slide? There we go. Okay, so that is the question that's being posed here. Can we go to the next slide, please? As this graph amply illustrates, for long time frames, we see that, and this data is derived primarily from ice cores, and we see that carbon dioxide actually is a lag indicator of global temperature change. That is, temperature tends to change first, and carbon dioxide tends to follow. So it's what is commonly referred to as a trailing artifact in the system. So simple logic tells us that carbon dioxide are the result of changing temperatures, not the cause. Next slide, please. Here we see that we've seen on a shorter time frame, we've seen significant cycling of temperatures over the past 1,000 years. The medieval warm period, there's ample evidence that this period was warmer than the current global temperatures, despite small CO2 inputs. So this again is indirect evidence that CO2 can't be causing temperatures to be warmer today than they were, let's say, 1,000 years ago. Next slide, please. This is from CFAN. If we look at how much carbon dioxide humans have put into the atmosphere, we see that we account for 1 in 10,000 parts per million by volume of the current atmospheric composition. To sit there and say that this is the control knob or the driver of the climate system, it on its face is awfully difficult to swallow. If one molecule of carbon dioxide can impact 10,000 others, in addition to impacting every molecule that's in the ocean and on the land, that would be a difficult stretch. We know that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It tends to be a very weak absorber of infrared radiation. And when you put this all together, it doesn't look very scary. It doesn't look like it's really driving the system. It's not the control knob that people are claiming that it is.
Thank you, Professor. And Judith, would you like to add something?
Thing that was stated by Art. There are interactions between carbon dioxide and temperature. An increasing temperature can cause release from the oceans of CO2. At the same time, adding CO2 from an external source can also change temperatures. So it works both ways. And over geologic history, that graph that you saw, there was no particularly large external source of carbon dioxide. So temperature was leading carbon dioxide. For the past 70, 80 years or so, there has been a significant input of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which drives temperature increase to some extent. How much, is highly uncertain. We understand the radiative impact of adding CO2 on the atmosphere. Radiative transfer theory is pretty well known and established. The big question is, are there positive feedbacks in the climate system that amplify this initial infrared radiation response to additional carbon dioxide? And there are to some extent. But the so-called sensitivity of the climate to carbon dioxide is highly uncertain. Is it relatively small or is it large? There's still a lot of debate on that topic. The question is, so CO2 does impact the Earth's climate. The question is, what is the magnitude? We don't really know. And how important is the impact of CO2 relative to natural climate variability? And these are things that there's a lot of disagreement and debate about.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Dr. Burnett, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I'm not going to sort of add anything to the CO2 question here. I would just say that the best evidence from measured temperatures is that we've had a modest rise in temperature. And it is far below what the models have projected based on the sensitivities, which indicates it's not as sensitive as the models assume. And when they've run models that don't have the feedback loops, that don't have the built-in assumptions about how feedbacks work, they do better at performing in tracking measured temperatures. And what they indicate is not alarming in the least. You know, the header of this is global crisis. What I can't see is any evidence that we face a global crisis from the rise in CO2 and the modest rise in temperatures. It's been warmer in the past. It wasn't a crisis then. In fact, it was a boon for humanity. And I see no evidence that any more modest rise, it would have to rise quite a bit to, based on, you know, the performance so far, to have really damaging results. When I hear, gosh, I've heard for 20 years now, in 2 years, we'll have a tipping point. In 10 years, it'll be too late. In 20 years, it'll be too late. And I see no evidence that there's some kind of tipping point that it's too late. In fact, history shows that wealthier societies do better in the face of weather extremes and climate change than poorer societies, and that the best response to climate change, whether the future gets warmer or cooler, is being able to adapt. And that adaptation, resilience, wealthier societies are more resilient and better able to adapt than poorer societies. And so what I think is pretty clear that we can't afford to eschew fossil fuels and modern society. Going back to U.S. Greenhouse gas emissions of the early 1800s is not an option in the U.S., and it shouldn't be an option anywhere else. We should be raising developing countries to our level, allowing them to adapt and be resilient in the face of climate change.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's a very good point. We've seen those articles too, and every couple of years, we see that it's only a couple of years left for our humanity to take an action, which means to spend more resources on some programs like Kyoto Protocol or Montreal, and we've seen the results. But let's come back for a second to the question of CO2 and what do we actually know about CO2, and is it true that even low concentrations of this gas are able to heat up our planet and cause so much damage? Elizaveta, would you like to share with us some information?
Да, с огромной радостью.
Yes, with great pleasure. And I would like to thank our esteemed experts for information provided and for the facts that indicates that CO2 cannot influence climate of our planet or to heat up atmosphere in some way. And I would like to introduce very interesting information. Probably our experts have heard of this already. I think it's worthy of our attention, and it looks like CO2 might have quite opposite effect on the atmosphere, not heating the atmosphere, but cooling it. And there are many scientific papers about this. And warming theory, actually, the greenhouse warming theory was first experimentally refuted back in 1908 by Robert Williams Wood, professor of experimental physics at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, would experimentally show that the greenhouse effect is not the same as greenhouse effect. And there are many works that already have been published confirming that greenhouse gases that actively absorbs infrared radiation do not heat, but cool the Earth's surface. For example, these are the works of Oleg Sarotkin, a geologist, geophysicist, and climatologist, honor scientist, commandant of the Russian Academy of Science. He developed the adiabatic theory of the greenhouse effect of the atmosphere. From this theory, it follows that an increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide should lead not to an increase but to a decrease of the temperature. He explained this by the fact that the heat capacity of carbon dioxide is 1.2 times lower than that terrestrial air. The balance on the planet is maintained by the fact that excess carbon dioxide is absorbed by the oceans. In 2009, an article was published by Habibullah Ismailovich Abusamatov, astrophysicist, head of the astronometry project of the Russian branch of the ICC and head of the Space Research Laboratory of Pulkovo Observatory and the Russian Academy of Science. The article is called "The increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere leads to cooling." To find out the actual effect on the average temperature on the Earth, the integral thermal balance of the underlying surface atmosphere outer space system was studied. As a result of the conducted studies, it was shown that an increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere above the current level can only lead to cooling and not to global warming. And small variations in the components of the heat balance don't change the conclusions obtained. Also, it is interesting that at the conference, which was held on December 4th, 2021, Global Crisis, Time for the Truth, that was presented by the honorary professor of the Institute of Theological Astrophysics of University of Oslo, Jan Erik Solheim from Norway. And he said he and his colleagues conducted a full-scale experiment, created greenhouses and pumped them with carbon dioxide. And as a result of the experiment, it also turned out that the increase in the concentration of CO2 only slows down the heating of the atmosphere. Similar results were obtained by our participants, volunteers of the Creative Society project. They took a simple sealed pipe and pumping CO2 from the exhaust pipe heated the space inside the pipe. And it turns out that CO2 only slows down the heating. Anyone can verify this by themselves, repeating this simple experiment. It is important for us to understand that the heating of the atmosphere is really happening right now. But as you already know from many researchers, the main cause are not only solar heat, but also endogenic heat that comes from the eruptions of underwater volcanoes and the heating of underground waters, the growth of seismicity. And this is shown by the results of Arthur de Tirita, and huge gratitude for you, Professor, for that. We also know that CO2, despite its meager concentrations, it's really growing now. And thanks to many honest researchers, we know that the increase in CO2 concentration is now occurring many times more for natural reasons, namely, which Judith Curry also mentioned, that the oceans, when they are heated up by the geothermal heat, now giving off more CO2. And excellent data on this was also demonstrated at the conference by Jan Erik Solheim. But what was unexpected and kind of anomaly here, that CO2 not only by trees, but trees begin to mutate and give CO2 not only at night but during the day instead of oxygen. And for example, it happens in some parts of the Amazon forest in Brazil. There are studies that say that this is probably due to the heating of the soils. Also, swamps, for example, in Russia, have also begun to give off more CO2 than to absorb. This is very anomalous, and it seems that now the increased heating from the bowels itself, on the surface as well, nature starts to compensate. It seems to be trying to cool the atmosphere and therefore produces more CO2 now. We know that IPCC models, like the rest of other models, show only what we put into them. If we put the equation that the temperature will rise from CO2, then with the increase of the concentration of CO2, we'll get the increase of temperatures. But field of experiments and theoretical calculations of people who directly study this shows that everything might be completely the opposite. How big lie is that? That CO2 actually cooled the atmosphere, not heated it. In fact, just imagine the scale of the scam that we are told right now. This lie can be destroyed only by uniting people and combining the efforts of honest scientists. Exactly now, that's what we need to do. That's what we do, and huge thanks to all the experts that are present here today on this round table. Probably this information about that CO2 is coolant will be new to someone, but this is actually new. It's not being studied enough, and not enough of attention is being directed there. It seems really interesting topic to study. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizaveta. So I would like to ask our experts to comment possibly this information. So Judith, please. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I would like to make a comment. I totally agree that we need to have all ideas considered on the table and explored, without commenting on without reading papers or looking at them carefully. I have no idea whether there's any merit to anything that was mentioned previously. But I will say that we need to put everything on the table. We have to even explore fringe, unusual ideas and evaluate them to see if there's any merit. And there's been too much focus in the scientific debate on global warming and climate change, just focusing on CO2. And that is not useful. I mean, we've ignored natural climate variability. We don't really understand enough about the global carbon cycle and so on. So there's a lot we don't understand. There's been, too much of a narrow look at, a few specific processes. So we need to look a little bit more broadly. But that said, there are some things that we are certain of that, it's useless to try to debate. I mean, global temperatures have increased, for at least 100 years. We shouldn't be debating that. Carbon dioxide does have an infrared emission spectra. We shouldn't be debating that. Humans are adding CO2 to the atmosphere. We shouldn't be debating that. That said, how all that adds up to influencing climate is still not very well understood. And there's a lot about natural climate variability that we don't understand very well. And until we understand natural climate variability, we're not going to understand exactly what the CO2 impact is on climate.
Thank you very much, Professor Kari. And just essentially you brought us to the next question about the natural variability and what are the main natural drivers for climate change and why these drivers don't get enough attention from scientific community. So possibly you can also address this question.
Okay. Well, the sun is a big climate driver. On relatively short time scales, there's a well-known 11-year solar cycle. There's lots of other longer-term oscillations in solar output. There's also indirect solar effects associated with cosmic rays, solar storms, magnetic field, all sorts of things which aren't well enough understood. There's a very vibrant community of solar researchers who are exploring these topics. And some of them say, well, what's going on with the sun can explain most of what we've seen in recent climate change, and that's, the observations just aren't good enough to discriminate between the two sides of the debate about the solar influence on climate. So that's uncertain. The impact of volcanoes are fairly well understood, but we can't predict volcanic eruptions at all. And the last 150 years were relatively quiet in terms of volcanic eruptions. In fact, it was the quietest period for the last millennia. So could we expect to see greater volcanic activity in the 21st century? Wouldn't surprise me at all. The other factor that really gets ignored as noise is the internal variability associated with large-scale ocean circulations. On the short time scales, El Nino and La Nina are well known. These have huge global impacts on the climate. And then we have decadal climate variability and multi-decadal and century scale and millennial scale associated with the deep ocean. And these have a substantial impact on the climate, including the Earth's surface temperature, via how not just redistributing the heat in the ocean, but the ocean circulations influence the atmospheric circulations, which influence the distribution of clouds, which influences how much sun gets reflected, and on it goes. You have all sorts of complicated processes. Then you have some scientists exploring the influence of the Earth's magnetic field on climate. And this is relatively poorly understood, but there are some very smart scientists who are exploring this, and this isn't very well known. So why has all this not received enough attention? Okay, in the IPCC and the climate community. Well, early on in the 1980s, the United Nations Environmental Program was very interested in getting rid of fossil fuels for environmental purposes, and they also were interested in global governance, and they seized upon the climate change problem. So they had a solution, getting rid of fossil fuels, before there was even any evidence that humans were, CO2 was warming the climate. This was in the 80s. By 1992, we had the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Treaty talking about dangerous anthropogenic warming. There was no signal yet. Okay, and then we had the Kyoto Protocol in 97. And certainly by 2000, we were seeing a signal of human-caused warming. I mean, that there was probably some impact of human-caused warming on this temperature increase. But we had the solution way out in front of the science. And so this, and the focus of the IPCC has been on dangerous anthropogenic climate change. And they define anthropogenic climate change as CO2 driven, ignoring land use and ignoring natural climate variability. So that's how we got to be this place. And so people working on solar variations and magnetic fields and all this have been marginalized by, the mainstream political focus on CO2 under the auspices of the IPCC and the UN Framework Convention.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. It's really brilliant explanation. Sterling, would you like to add to? Yes, please take a word.
When the IPCC was first formed under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, they were charged with studying the human causes of climate change. Well, if you're giving directions to study the human causes, other things go by the side. And every report through the first 5 reports would always list a variety of factors that drive climate change, that impact climate change one way or the other, positively or negatively. And by climate change, I mean weather, I mean temperature, how much forcing it adds to the system. And they were confident from the beginning they understood CO2. Later, they became confident they understood the other greenhouse gases that humans might emit. But the sun, clouds, a major factor, clouds and water vapor in the atmosphere. Water vapor is the dominant greenhouse gas no one talks about. Oceans circulation, they would list every report, every major report. These are the factors, and then they would tell you what they expect, their range of how much impact, positive or negative, it could have. And then they tell you how well they understood every factor that wasn't CO2 and later other greenhouse gases was only poorly understood or not well understood. And yet they were confident that the only thing they really understood, that was driving the whole boat. And that's circular reasoning. And they said, well, look, here's how we know that. We run climate models. And if we take the CO2 out, they don't perform, they don't produce the results we expect. Well, so what? If the results you expect aren't tracking reality, if they aren't showing the temperature change that you say it should be, maybe the problem is expecting CO2 to drive everything. Maybe you should start studying the other things and see how they have an impact. It's circular reasoning. We expect CO2 to produce certain temperatures. We take CO2 of our models, the temperatures aren't produced, so we know CO2 drives the temperature, even though the temperature doesn't match reality. And in the last report, this is AR6, Assessment Report 6, they jettisoned almost all talk of natural factors. They don't even have the chart anymore where it says poorly understood, well understood. No. We don't want to talk about that. The only time they talk about clouds, you'd think clouds didn't exist unless humans put aerosols into the air. Every new report diminishes the role of natural factors. And that's in part because they're charged with studying human causes, but it's also in part because if all the money is going to study human causes, not a lot of money, not a lot of research is going to study natural causes. They're not getting into the journals. The professors that talk about those aren't getting rewarded in academia. And so you don't have a lot of academic material you can put into a report on it. So, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you say natural factors aren't playing a role, you'll find, no one's getting published in natural factors, so natural factors aren't playing a role.
I've read the fine print of the AR6 quite thoroughly, and for the first time, I do see a discussion of natural variability in the AR6. And let me tell you why. The AR5 got caught out with that hiatus or the pause where there was little to no warming since 1998. And everybody realizes that it's natural climate variability. And they're also concerned about how are we going to know when we've crossed these 1.5 or 2 degrees thresholds, because there's a lot of noise from natural variability. So suddenly they are motivated to study natural variability. For the first time in the climate models, the CMIP6 climate models, they did have a real scenario of solar variations over the next few centuries, which produce a little bit of cooling, is what they're projecting. They also had a moderate volcanic scenario that they added, and they also downplayed the climate models in the IPCC AR6, which were running way too hot, by the way, because they did something fancy with the cloud aerosol interactions, and the climate sensitivity for the CMIP6 models were way too high. So they downplayed the climate model simulations. So this is a step in the right direction. But so if you go into the weeds of the Working Group 1 report for the AR6, there's a lot of discussion of natural variability. But if you just read the high-level summary for policymakers, then you see, the same old story about, CO2 driven this and that. So the other thing that they did which I think is really wrong, is they narrowed the range of equilibrium climate sensitivity. For many decades, the likely range has been between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees centigrade. Now, all of a sudden, the AR6 narrowed it from 2.5 to 4 degrees. Excuse me, effectively throwing out that lower end between 1.5 and 2.5 degrees, which is where I think the real value lies. And my colleague, Nick Lewis in the UK, is working on a paper that shows what they did wrong and why this narrowing of the range of equilibrium climate sensitivity was unjustified. So the thing is, to really understand you have to read the whole report, and it's a really long report, but the summary for policymakers is pure politics. All of the good stuff and a lot of the more sensible stuff is really in the main text.
Yeah, really great points. Yeah, thank you very much to both of you. And yeah, it's really amazing what you brought, and we will be further continuing how much we can trust to IPCC. I probably will give a word. I will give a word to Professor Vicerita, because he was doing the studies on the natural factors, and it would be really also happy to hear your perspective.
Okay, could we put the slide up again? This is a lot of this is repeat. Judy, I think we're reading off the same page here. A number of natural drivers, of course, have been identified in the Earth atmosphere system. I mean, all the textbooks and the professional literature all address this. Solar variability. Yes, we do know about sunspot numbers. We know about the 11 and 22-year cycles. We know of longer cycles. We also have to consider Earth's orbital changes. That's the Milankovitch cycling, where we see changes in the eccentricity of the orbit, the precession of the equinoxes, and also the tilt of the axis. These we know, we think, are drivers of glacials and interglacials on a much larger scale. We have to look at subaerial and submarine volcanic activity. Subaerial volcanic activity, of course, puts a lot of aerosol into the atmosphere and can cause significant cooling. Submarine, on the other hand, has a very different effect. It can warm the ocean bottom, and this can cause changes to ocean currents, which is the next point. That is, changes in ocean currents are clearly another variable that we have to look at and understand. Changes in cloud cover, changes in snow and ice cover, and changes in the atmospheric composition, to include changes in the CO2. Somebody asked me, they said, what do you think the contribution of anthropogenic CO2 is? And I said, by my statistical modeling of this, it's greater than zero, but it's less than statistically significant. So yes, we do know that it does absorb infrared radiation. We know that this can cause a small degree of heating. At least this is the accepted sort of paradigm in thermodynamic theory right now. But nonetheless, it's we're talking really a minor gas, both in terms of its volume and in terms of its ability to absorb infrared radiation. So next slide, please. In 2006, I tried to tackle one of these natural drivers. That is, I became keenly interested in the mid-ocean spreading zones. And I was looking at volcanic activity down in the mid-ocean spreading zones. And I have what I consider to be a working hypothesis that pretty much entails many of the natural drivers. Increased geothermal flux from the mid-ocean spreading zones destabilizes the bottom waters. This is amply demonstrated in the oceanographic literature. This causes the thermohaline circulation to intensify. That, again, is well documented in the oceanographic literature. This transports more heat into the Arctic. This in turn leads to a melting of snow and ice, lowering the Arctic's albedo, and triggers a positive feedback known as the Arctic amplification. And we know that the main driver for the Arctic amplification is a process that they now refer to as Atlantification. And here's a flow chart of how that process works. Greater geothermal flux on the ocean floor intensifies the thermohaline circulation. In my latest paper, I document this at length. This causes increased oceanic heat transport into the Arctic. This, in and of itself, increases Arctic temperatures, and feeding back on that, this reduces snow and ice cover, which reduces the Arctic albedo, which again serves as another positive feedback to the system. So here you can see that this one variable, that is the introduction of additional geothermal heat on the ocean bottom, does a number of things. It alters the ocean currents, it alters the snow and ice balance, also alters the cloud cover, and as a result, alters Arctic temperatures. And we know that the Arctic amplification is the most prominent feature of the latest quote-unquote global warming. The southern hemisphere has barely warmed since, and I start my tracking in 1979, because this is when we have very granular data on both the mid-ocean seismic activity, which is the proxy for geothermal emission, and also for what I think are much more accurate temperature data for the entire globe. And if we go to the next slide, I have plotted the recent temperature change starting in 1979 with the mid-ocean seismic activity, which, as we said, is a proxy for geothermal heat release. And we see that we have a very high correlation. The correlation here is now currently sitting at 0.73, and it is a higher correlation than CO2 as it relates to temperature. Clearly, it is significant. It needs to be explored further. And it does appear, the literature strongly supports the idea that this is impacting other feedbacks and other drivers to the system.
Thank you, Professor Judith. Yeah, it's definitely interesting investigation for one factor, but as you all mentioned that there are so many different factors. Sterling, would you like to add your comment?
Well, I just wanted to say, I raise a question, not a comment so much, is the idea that the modest rise in temperatures we've experienced is bad, and that a continued rise. There's certainly a point beyond which global average temperature rising would be bad, but I see no evidence that we know that 1.5 degrees is disaster, that 2 degrees is disaster. Where we got the idea that we have the God's eye point of view and we know what the ideal temperature of the Earth is, I think is largely made up, or it's built upon the idea of the multiple feedback mechanisms that they think will occur, that the climate models are built in to show occur with rising CO2 and rising temperatures. But if those feedback mechanisms don't work as assumed, as built into the models, then I see no reason for thinking a modest rise of temperature of 2 degrees even, which they say, that we've got to keep it below 2 degrees or we're in trouble. Why we should think that we know that's disastrous for humans, it puzzles me.
Okay, I have a couple of comments on both recent comments. Art's mechanism, makes a lot of sense, and I think it is a viable mechanism. It just makes physical sense. The question is, what is the magnitude of that relative to everything else? And it's certainly an important thing to pursue. Regarding dangerous and the 2 degree and 1.5 threshold, dangerous for the planet, no. I mean, the Earth will be fine at higher temperatures and higher carbon dioxide. It has been, much higher in previous geological epochs. So the issue is not dangerous for the environment or the planet. We're talking about social impacts, dangers to humans. Okay, so what constitutes? So the dangers associated with the slow creep of warming is basically the slow creep of sea level rise and also increased heat extremes. Excuse me. This is what the dangers are. And if you have enough energy, you can, keep buildings air conditioned and you don't need to suffer too much. And, plants will adapt and you can plant different crops and different hybrids and all this kind of thing. It's not real dangerous. What they've tried to say extreme weather events are caused by global warming, and they aren't. And apart from heat waves, there's really no evidence that anything else is, particularly influenced by a temperature increase. So that doesn't work. The real concern is some sort of environmental tipping point. That would really change the climate in an abrupt and unfortunate way. And, that's happened, in the geologic past. It can happen again, the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet, something related to permafrost, all sorts of things that you can imagine. And the question is, these are mostly driven by, natural Earth system variability. The question is, will a warming climate, help trigger some of those tipping points? Well, we don't know. They might help minimize other tipping points. We really don't know. And these tipping points do not occur at 2 degrees warming or anything like that. They just happen as a result of an interaction of complex Earth system processes. So the issue of danger, to me, is the weakest part of the whole argument. I mean, yes, it's warming, CO2 is contributing, but is warming dangerous? It causes changes. I mean, that there may be some places that end up drier or moister as a result of warming. The new breadbasket may be Canada and, and Russia and northern China rather than more of the, the mid-latitudes. I mean, that could happen. Change, the climate is going to change. And, independent of us, we may be changing it in one direction or another. If you take a really long game, 10,000 years kind of thing, we'll eventually see another ice age and, maybe we're helping stave it off. So, this idea of dangerous climate change, I think, is a weak one. Do we want to, it's the weakest part of their argument is whether all this is dangerous.
I have to wholeheartedly agree with that. And in fact, they even argue that if we look in the recent geological past, the Younger Dryas, for example, we saw an abrupt change in the warming, and we got a brief period of intense cooling, and it was caused by increased warming. That is, the glacial melt shut down the thermohaline circulation, so that served as a negative feedback, which thrust us back into a cooling phase. So we haven't identified which positive feedbacks are good and which negative feedbacks are good. So we may get negative feedbacks that could possibly be dangerous. But again, as Judy says, we don't know. There's too many unknowns out there.
Well, I was just going to say, this gets us back to what I was saying, at the outset, is we don't know. We know, climate changes, B, it's warming. C, CO2 is going up. We know CO2 is good for certain things like plants. What we don't know is what form any kind of tipping point or disaster would take. So it's valuable. We've got to keep studying CO2 and we've got to keep studying everything else. But for the world, for humanity, not talking about the earth, because Judy's right, the earth abides. Regardless of what we do, the earth is going to be okay. But human society can get better or worse. Okay, we can live better lives or we can live worse off. And right now, we've got over 1 billion people living in abject poverty and energy poverty that don't have access to modern technologies, and we want to deny them that. And to me, that's immoral. And in denying them that, we also make them less capable of responding and adapting to climate change, in whatever form it takes. The difference between what happens in Louisiana or Texas, where I'm at, when a hurricane hits, and what happens in Indonesia or Malaysia when a typhoon hits, isn't the strength of the storm. It's the degree of infrastructure and development and our ability to predict it and to respond to it and to get away from it, quite frankly. There's a reason why hundreds of thousands of people or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people may die in some developing countries when a storm hits or when a tidal wave hits. And, 100 or 1,000, a couple of thousand may die in a really, really bad, weird occurrence like happened in New Orleans when the levees broke, not really the storm. The difference is we're much wealthier. And so we can adapt to different kinds of climate changes. We don't know what form climate changes will take. We should try and anticipate what forms they will take. But what we shouldn't do is put ourselves on a path to poverty and make ourselves poorer and less able to adapt at the same time as we shouldn't be denying people who are much less well off than us the ability to make themselves wealthier and to adapt better, whatever form climate change may take, whatever impacts it might have on weather events.
Спасибо. Я хотела бы дополнить, возвращаясь к вопросу об опасности.
Thank you so much. I would like to add regarding the danger of the climate change that's taking place right now. You mentioned that the temperature is rising, CO2 is increasing, and actually the level of the ocean is growing as well. But not only that, as a geologist, I know as well that throughout the geological history, all the time some kind of catastrophes took place and large-scale extinctions, and I just admired the work of Arthur Vittorito, and he said really interesting thing right now regarding the dryas, that it was the sharp, catastrophic temperature change and the rise of the level of the world ocean after the glaciation. And what happened back then, more serious and strong volcanic eruptions took place. These eruptions in Europe, where whole Europe was covered with ash. It happened 12,000 years ago. And if we go back to the question of adaptability, 12,000 years ago, 75% of megafauna died out. And what is happening right now, except the rise of temperature and CO2, we see that the seismicity is growing at the bottom of the ocean along the ring fire, and the seismic activity and the earthquakes are growing, and we don't understand why. We see that volcanic activity is growing, and underwater volcanoes activity is growing as well, and we don't understand why from the point of view of geology. We see that the Earth started to rotate faster, it accelerated, and it's abnormal. Those who investigate the rotation of the Earth, they say that it's abnormal rotation right now, and it's happened in the last 30 years, and we don't know why it's going on. Last 30 years, more than ever, glaciers are melting, and everyone knows that western glaciers are melting as well because of the volcanoes underneath them. But we don't know actually what is going on. We are in our society in a situation when they are being imposed on us the false idea of climate change. As Judith says, that our attention is being narrowed down, but we cannot adequately see all the risks that we are facing, and we don't understand whether the earthquakes will be stronger or weaker. Right now, there are no trends for everything to start to come down. Magnetic field is changing right now, as well as the same as it took place 12,000 years ago when the Dryas, the same took place, the mammoth extinct, volcanoes erupted, but right now we think that maybe it will pass by us and everything will be smooth. We don't know that, but we must know that. That's why it is so important to study all aspects comprehensively. And of course, this is really important to adequately look at all the risks. And thanks to everyone, this is really interesting.
Thank you very much, Elizaveta. And I'm kind of really stunned with our discussion today because it's... Judith, please go ahead.
Okay, yeah, just a quick comment. What we need are some additional narratives of possible danger, from other sources beyond CO2. Like what could happen? We need a broader range of narratives of things that we should possibly be thinking about and planning for, not in the sense of, trying to avoid every crazy scenario, but to have a plan for how we might approach these issues if they were to become more salient. Just focusing everything on CO2 and all of our resources on CO2 and potentially making our societies less prosperous and diminishing energy security even, we're sort of using up all of everything we have in the bank to deal with other threats, some of which may be anticipated and some which wouldn't be.
Yeah, that's a really great comment. Thank you very much. And essentially, Judith, I was reading your blog and the article about the existential threat. There you mentioned this recent movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, and I like your comment that in the end of the day we don't know anything about supervolcanoes, right? And that's really great point. And what I would like to say, to me, I find it's really amazing, and that you are, as a scientist, put humans first, and you address what would happen with humans and how we will deal with it as a society. And what I essentially, what I took from your discussions is that, Judith, you're saying that we have a problem for CO2 and a separate problem for extreme weather events. And these are separate problems and which are not interfering. And it is very important because for the most of people, the narrative goes as we have carbon dioxide and therefore we observing all these horrible events. And essentially, it's no one talking about this. Very often when we talk to eyewitnesses, we see that they were not alarmed, that they did not get notification even about volcanoes eruption. And how horrible is that? And what we had is that we had, when we were preparing for a conference for 4th of December, we were interviewing a lot of scientists, and we did interview the former head of IPCC, Sir Bob Watson. We interviewed all other scientists, and this question about what Stern brought, that how much we should ask about temperature. Is it really true parameter we should focus on? Is it really the measure of the current changes? And all of them replying, yes, this is brilliant. Yes, like it's exactly showing us what is going on. And while we are discussing here, and you're bringing all these great points that we don't understand so many factors, we don't understand what triggers changes. I think it is really misleading, and I think that people need to know about these changes, and that these are separate problems. So,
okay,
yes.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot about risk lately, including the perception of risk. You know, there's a lot of people out there thinking that we're facing literally an existential threat, you know, on the time scale of decades, which is insane. But people are more afraid of man-made than natural risks. They dread, you know, they're more afraid of like something that's immediate, like a hurricane, than they are the slow creep of CO2. They're more threatened by something, a risk that they can't see, like CO2. It seems scarier to them than something, you know, that they're more familiar with. So the people who are trying, the activists who are trying to sell this climate crisis an existential threat, you know, seize on the elements of the climate change problem, like extreme weather events and whatever, that they know will scare people, you know, and cause dread. But, you know, misperceiving the risk is a really big risk in itself, okay, and what we're facing. And so we've got potential destabilization because people are so scared and perceive an urgency, okay, and people are ignoring the transition risk. The transitioning to net zero, I mean, has a very large risk, and the knowledge base for that one is pretty solid. We know what we're facing, and it's not good. So, you know, risk perception, I think, is really what we're dealing with. Misperception, risk misperception.
I think that's exactly right. Now we know some risks, right? We don't know whether hurricanes will increase or decrease in the future, but we know every year we're going to have hurricanes and cyclones. We have a really poor understanding of the ability to predict volcanic eruptions. That would be something, or earthquakes. That would be something we could pour a lot of money into, improve our understanding of that, and thus reduce risk, real risk, hard risk to lots of people today. We can put money into the things that we know are going to persist. Tornadoes in North America will happen regardless of climate change. Droughts will occur regardless of climate change. They may get better, they may get worse, but we know they're going to occur. So we can build resilience and adaptability into our system. But the question is going to net zero take us further down the path to being resilient, to being adaptable? And as Judy said, we have some answers to that. Making the world poorer, the transition cost, McKinsey just came out with a report. How much will it cost us to get net zero? Not accounting for any transaction costs, not accounting for any political costs, lobbying, not accounting for skewing. If we don't come up with the perfect transition system, $270 trillion by 2050 is what they estimated. A little bit more than the $4 trillion Joe Biden had estimated when he ran for office. Now, that's $30 billion a day, every day until 2050. Is that really the best? Even if we had that money, I mean, the world is not, money doesn't fall from heaven, even though the government may think it does, and then it prints it and inflation goes through the roof. But since money doesn't fall from heaven, we have to decide what are the trade-offs going to different activities, and how much what will we gain from going to net zero? And I think the best estimate is trying to get net zero by 2050 is going to cost far more than any reasonably expected change from an increase in CO2. Now, there may be tipping points that we don't understand, but the truth is those tipping points may exist regardless of what we do. The next ice age could start coming back regardless of what we do. And as far as I know, we have no ability to stop the next ice age if it starts coming back. So my point is, we can plan for the things we can reasonably expect. I don't think anyone can reasonably expect the damages from continued modest rise of temperature are going to be greater than $270 trillion by 2050 going to net zero at a conservative estimate.
Thank you so much, Sterling, for bringing this up. And that's actually a very important point that we didn't take into account until now, because, well, at the beginning, Judith mentioned that there are political interests which interfere how scientists work, right? That's a major factor. But also money. Of course, we have to take into account that a lot of people making their living, making their income, the whole corporate interest in here, basically on CO2 agenda, on trading quotas. And we actually have a video prepared. That video was presented at the Global Crisis Time for the Truth conference, and we would like to show it to you and our viewers right now. It's about CO2 and the financial part of it.
Global warming is not only the #1 environmental challenge we face today, but one of the most important issues facing all of humanity. Leonardo DiCaprio, actor. Many of us know that the planet is warming because of increased greenhouse gases, that we don't know the exact consequences of that. Greta Thunberg, eco-activist. There is no convincing scientific evidence that anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, or other greenhouse gases cause or may cause catastrophic heating of the Earth in the foreseeable future and the destruction of its climate. Frederick Seitz, former president of the U.S. Academy of Sciences, professor. Neither the rate nor the magnitude of the reported late 20th century surface warming 1979 to 2000 lay outside normal natural variability. Robert Carter, geologist. Every day, millions of people on the planet are suffering from climatic disasters. How is climate change being dealt with internationally today? What mechanisms are in place for this, and how do they work? Today, almost everyone on the planet has heard about the anthropogenic impact on the climate, about greenhouse gas emissions, and the global warming associated with them. The whole world is combating greenhouse gas emissions, while international organizations and countries are trying to influence climate change. But do you know exactly how it happens? In '97, a number of countries adopted a general agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. To enforce this decision, various countries have introduced economic mechanisms that encourage manufacturers to abandon fossil fuels. The primary mechanism is international emissions trading. Each country sets a limit, a cap, on the total amount of CO2 emissions they will allow each year. It is measured in carbon credits. A carbon credit is equal to 1 ton of CO2 emissions, and the right to release a certain amount of CO2 emissions is called a quota. Established quotas for greenhouse gas emissions are shared by industries and companies within the country. A manufacturer who has reduced their emissions and has not used a part of their quota can sell that portion of their carbon credits on an exchange. A manufacturer who has exceeded the quotas is required to buy them. It turns out that greenhouse gas emissions are a new commodity that is being bought and sold. The the right to emit pollutants is traded on carbon exchanges similar to a stock market. This market generated $272 billion in revenues in the year 2020. Another mechanism for regulating CO2 emissions is a carbon tax. It is a fee levied on companies that burn fossil fuels. These taxes go to the budgets of countries, and each country decides where to allocate these funds. Now, what is the purpose of these market mechanisms, and how can trade and taxes help with climate change? The tax and quota on CO2 raises the cost of any commodity that is produced using carbon energy, and it also bumps up the price of the energy resources themselves. That is, hydrocarbon energy is being made so expensive that we just couldn't afford it. But do they give us anything in return? Humankind is offered to switch to the green energy, but there are certain questions. First, this kind of energy is unstable and cannot provide us with the necessary amount of energy. Secondly, it turns out that green energy is more expensive than hydrocarbon energy. Most interestingly, we still have to use the same hydrocarbons to produce the elements for green power plants. Additional climate taxation and the quota system bring good profits to various organizations in particular states. But in the end, who will pay for all this? The question is rhetorical. So what happens? We are destroying the existing energy industry, but we have not yet created a viable replacement. At the same time, this raises the price of the resource without which no person can survive. During this year, the price of CO2 emission quotas in Europe has doubled. As a result, prices on energy markets have risen as well. In October 2021, prices per megawatt of energy in Europe were 6 to 8 times higher than in 2020. Consequently, this affected the economic situation in the world, which had a direct impact on the well-being of every person. But back to the topic of climate. More than 20 years have passed since the Kyoto Protocol was signed. According to a report by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, total climate finance for 2016 to 2019 amounted to $287 billion and is growing each year. Most of this financing was allocated to projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. According to the World Meteorological Organization, CO2 levels reached a critical point in 2020. After every international treaty, CO2 emissions have been measured, and we see that in 2021, despite enormous funding, the emissions curve is skyrocketing. There is another important point. Have all these measures helped solve the real climate problems? Do we see a reduction in the growth of natural disasters and weather anomalies? Has the ecological situation on the planet improved? Have we started to live in a safer and more comfortable world? Perhaps everyone should just look around and honestly answer all of these questions.
Well, I'm sure that for many people this is some new information, but yeah, it's really like that. A lot of money is being spent each year. Actually, the estimate was around over 600 billion just last year for fighting CO2, but the results are close to none. Maybe some comments from our experts on the video, and let me start with... Yeah, sure. Yeah,
well,
please go ahead.
Look, I thought it was a brilliant video. It asked some important questions, but first I'd like to make one point. It talks about CO2 pollution. I don't consider CO2 a pollutant. I exhale CO2. I don't think I'm polluting anything when I do so. It's a greenhouse gas, but it's not toxic at any foreseeable level, which is what you when you talk about pollutants, it's usually something that's going to compromise your health at some foreseeable level. Concerning the you made a point in that video that I didn't make and should have. And so that's a failing on my part. It's that all the spending, let's say they spent the $270 trillion it would take to get to net zero. And so we get to net zero, and it actually keeps the temperature below what they say is critical. So let's say that gets you to 1.5 degrees. I don't think it'll do that, but let's say, imagine if they did. They can't claim that it will reduce hurricanes at all. They can't claim it'll reduce tornadoes at all. They certainly can't claim it'll do anything about earthquakes or volcanic eruptions at all. It won't, as far as I can tell, prevent the seas from continuing to rise, because past interglacials have shown seas continue to rise until the next interglacial comes. Seas rose more than 400 feet since the end of the last ice age, before we started pumping CO2 into the atmosphere. You know, King Canute made the joke with his courtiers. He stands in the seas, and yet they continue to rise. You said if I willed it, it would stop. Well, the point is, we can spend all that money, I'm imagining hypothetically, we stop the temperature from rising more than they say is terrible, and we will have done nothing about hurricanes, tornadoes, any of these natural disasters, and we will have spent all that money and not made society more resilient, not made people better able to adapt to sea level rise, to changes in weather, to natural disasters, not made the society richer. And that makes everyone worse off. So it's not just that, can we do it? It's, so what if we do it? If we do it, does it make the world better? And I would argue that it doesn't make the world better. It leaves us in a worse situation. Taking the U.S. back to the CO2 emissions of the 1820s doesn't give me confidence that my life is going to be better off. Or more importantly, because, by 2050, if I'm still alive, I'll be ancient. It doesn't make me confident that my nieces will be better off. And it certainly gives me no confidence whatsoever that the poor around the world will have been made better off, better able to respond to typhoons, better able to grow foods, things like that.
Okay. The big mistake that was made in the 1980s was conflating climate change, if it's a problem, with energy as the cause of the problem and then the solution. It's like we mischaracterize this as a dose response problem, which was completely misguided. That said, we do need, in the 21st century, we need more energy, not less, much, much more, not just to supply the billion people that currently don't have access to grid electricity, but all the new things that we want to do, innovate and progress, and requires energy, more energy. So we need more energy, not less. We need a 21st century energy infrastructure that's better than what we have now. We need more reliable power sources. We need cheap, abundant, better security. We probably need sources that are more local to avoid the geopolitical problems that we've had with oil and fossil fuels. To me, that's the biggest argument against oil and fossil fuels, is that you get caught up in geopolitical conflicts, the most recent one being between Russia and Europe. So we need more reliable in-country sources. There are a bunch of new technologies on the table: Generation 4, nuclear power, advanced geothermal, the prospect of fusion. There are all sorts of things on the table, and we need to push forward, independent of global warming or whatever, just to move humanity forward in the 21st century. New technologies, new infrastructure, and more abundant and cheap energy for everyone in the world. I mean, that's what we should be targeted at. And putting these deadlines, we need to show this much by 2030. And the quickest way to do that is to put up a windmill. I mean, that's nuts. I mean, let's really figure out and invest in all these new technologies and start testing them, and let each country find its own solution based on its land use and its natural resources, and then we can really make progress. But right now, this path via renewables is leading us to regress. And let's face it, natural gas in particular is going to be a critical bridge fuel through this transition. There's just no way around it. And trying to cut off the source of our current energy and tax and whatever, and hopefully carbon credits and all these crazy mechanisms are somehow going to produce cheap and abundant energy for everybody. I mean, it's a fairy tale.
One quick response to that is that we had a grid in the United States. Many countries don't have the grid, but we had a grid in the United States that was designed by engineers and worked fairly well. You had emergencies. Storms would knock down power lines because they're built above ground rather than underground. You had emergencies, so you'd have blackouts. You'd have a few times when there'd be surges because you have more people than you're building new generation and transmission. But now we're getting increasingly in the United States a grid designed not by engineers, but by politicians through mandate. And they're making our electric system dependent on the weather. The very thing that they're saying is becoming more extreme and becoming less predictable, yet we're making our power system more dependent on the weather cooperating. If the sun's going to shine, well, you get some power. If the wind's going to blow, well, you get some power. When I had when coal was providing power, I didn't have to worry about whether the sun was shining or the wind was blowing, and my refrigerator worked. My lights came on when I flicked them on. When natural gas does that, when nuclear does that, what they call baseload power systems, and we're taking baseload off and replacing them with intermittent power sources. And that's crazy. No engineer would have designed a system based on, is the weather going to cooperate today for us to have electricity? Yet that's where they're taking us. That's where the politicians are taking us.
Yes, Sterling. It would be funny if it wasn't so serious, but actually there is a funny meme that we would like to show you that actually portrays. And why is it that we're showing these memes? Because it's a social response from the people to these topics. So, but it's not just the funny picture. It is the actual representation of what happened in Germany last winter when there were no wind, there were cloudy weather for the whole winter, and they had to buy a tremendous amount of energy from the markets. Again, the gas from Russia and the nuclear energy from neighbor countries. So what are we doing? Does it make any sense, or are we just driven by this political agenda, corporate interest, or do we have any perception of how do we do something gradually without hurting our lives, without hurting our society? And in this regard, I would like to pass the floor to our speaker from Czech Republic. Dusan is actually an active participant of Creative Society Project and one of the speakers of Global Crisis Time for the Truth Conference. Please, Dusan, the floor is yours.
Dobrý den.
Hello.
Professor Vitoritos said today, and it is true, how can 1/10,000th of 1% affect the climate of our planet? How can 400th% affect the entire atmosphere? That's less than a microdose. And is this the main cause? And why even the trees have started to emit more CO2, and the wetlands and the oceans? But for some reason, they're taxing us. You know, they also accuse us of supporting hydrocarbons and being sponsored by oil companies. No one is sponsoring us. We are spending our own money to get ourselves together. You are some of the smartest people. You know how the green energy is being produced and how much money is spent on its production, maintenance and disposal. And what is the efficiency of that energy? Can it be compared to hydrocarbons or nuclear power? And at the time when the climate is changing, there will be bitter cold, terrible winds and hell on earth. We are told about solar panels and wind farms. A lot of money is being spent on that and supposedly fighting the climate. But that is a lie, and it's just killing us. Scientists who do not support CO2 are being persecuted. And why is that? Because they are all divided and there are corrupt journalists. Of course, when you have hundreds of billions, you can buy any journalists or politicians to continue stealing in such quantities. They get hundreds of billions and they've already opened their mouths to trillions. For what? Have they planted even one tree? But what's the point of planting trees if they mutate and release carbon dioxide? They've spent 7% of the 632 billion on human adaptation. And who have they adapted? And for what and how? Let them show it. What have they done? What have they enhanced? What did they stop? Did they stop the permafrost from melting? It's nonsense. Schizophrenia. They've spent $100 to plug the hole and written off billion. They fought for 40 years, spent hundreds of billions, and CO2 hasn't been reduced by 0.1%. And if this money was given to normal scientists and all the conditions were created, gather real sane people and scientists from all over the world, not these rhapsodies and Judases who are corrupt just to get titles, honors and money. We need to unite the real scientists and anyone who supports creative society, who cares. If we all start talking to people together, people will support us, and it will not be possible to lie to people. And people will ask, what have you spent trillions from our pockets on? If they have spent our taxpayers' money, we have the right to ask what they have spent it on and why they have spent it inefficiently. Where is the money? And where is the result? They must all be accountable to us people. And every day more people die and more houses are destroyed. Why do they persecute the scientists who tell the truth and study the real causes, while the ones who do nothing and not the CO2 then get titles and credentials and everyone talks about them? Why is this? They lie and drag out the time. Time passes and problems grow. No one has even come close to a solution. And this is the worst part. And real scientists should be making money. They should have no financial constraints. You're one of the smartest people in the world here. Tell me, is there any alternative to creative society? What besides creative society will allow all scientists to consolidate, connect, and realistically research climate change without constraints, so that all scientists can work together on it full-time instead of developing weapons? Now they just invent new rockets. And how about getting these very smart people together and figuring out how we can protect our planet? And who else but us? We, the people, can only support you scientists and experts and fight to create such conditions for you. Conditions favorable for work, so that everyone can find a way together without politics and nonsense. After all, the climate is killing us, and the changes are increasing, and no one but you, the honest scientists of the planet, can figure out why this is happening. The sellouts who advocate CO2 are certainly not going to save us. Every day, the world lives under the flag of the anthropogenic CO2 theory is a day that brings our entire world closer to grave, an irretrievably lost day. We believe we must support you, the honest scientists and experts. That's why we need creative society, to create the conditions for honest scientists and provide them with unlimited funding to tackle the global changes of climate change. And we are very grateful that you are with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dusan. And I would like to essentially to ask all of you about how much essentially scientists today can openly speak about other reasons and have access to the resources and like really to raise their opinions.
Concerning resources, I guess I don't have a lot to say about which scientists should or shouldn't be getting resources. I do know that that the scientists who don't support the idea that humans are causing a climate crisis are not getting funding, and they're being suppressed. I think to some extent Judy has experienced this. I can't speak for Arthur, but I know scientists who have, and I know people are being suppressed in social media. They're being deplatformed. They're being fact-checked by people who simply disagree with them and then are forced to admit, well, we don't like your context. So it's not a fact that you got wrong. We think it wasn't the proper context. So we know that's going on. But I'd like to, Judy and Arthur might want to say something about how much scientists or where the scientists should get funding. I don't think unlimited funding is ever an option for anything. But I'd like to see more of the funding not going to science and more of the funding going to either left in our pockets so we can decide how to spend our money and what's best for us going forward in the future. And the next generation of entrepreneurs might have money that wasn't taken in taxes, or we don't crush future generations in debt, to create new technologies that make us all better off. That's not going to come from scientists studying solar systems. That's going to come from leaving money in entrepreneurs' pockets, in people's pockets, in developing countries, helping them with micro banking to generate resources so they can become wealthier now, thus better able to adapt to future climate conditions, whatever they may be. And to the extent that we're going to devote funds to climate change, the gentleman who spoke was correct, is that they were spending all this money on things that do nothing to help the people that are going to be most impacted by weather events. If we're going to spend money on this, rather than spending more and more on esoteric science, I want to spend more and more on reducing real world impacts of extreme weather or sea level rise, hardening coastal cities. That would have an appreciable impact on making people's lives better in the future. That's my thought.
Very well said. The policy issue is how is the climate of the scientific issue that's relevant for policy is how is the climate of the 21st century going to play out? We have no idea. Apart from the uncertainties in the climate models, there's unpredictable, some of it's just flat out unpredictable. It's not just a lack of knowledge. So, of course, we should continue to research and improve our understanding, and we should look to incorporate, a broader range of processes and pay more attention to what things that are well outside the mainstream, of course, we should do that. But I agree that, funding isn't really the issue. Let's just let the scientists play out. But, the IPCC is diminishing in, utility. But the thing we do, I totally agree, is that we need to focus on building resilience, reducing our vulnerability. And this is fundamentally a national level or a regional issue. We need to get rid of this top-down global UN kind of, dictates and mandates. And we need for each country and each region to secure its own, economic and interest and whatever other values they have that they're trying to promote. We need to show them how they can do this with technologies and governance and whatever else. But we need more of a bottom-up approach to figuring out how to deal with the effects of 21st climate variability and change, however it might play out. And sea level rise, flooding, droughts, better water management, like I said before, a 21st century energy infrastructure with truly abundant energy. I mean, this is what we should be focused on. Geophysical climate science has probably taken us as far as we're going to get. Not that I would discourage further science, but in terms of the decisions that people should be making, we just need to acknowledge that we don't really know how the climate of the 21st century is going to play out. We will be surprised. I can count on that. But we just need to get on with trying to figure out how we improve our infrastructures, our societies, our operational responses to extreme weather events, and so on.
Absolutely agree with you, Judith. Thank you so much. And what we see, what you mentioned, basically, that we follow this narrative which been pushed on us from the media and big names and IPCC and UN Climate Action Supported, which is basically a huge marketing campaign that goes being pushed on us. And we here today, we are the people creating the request, as Sterling said, to relocate the foundation, to spend the money on studying the natural causes and drivers. And actually, if we dive a little bit deeper into this marketing part of this whole narrative of anthropogenic factor, we can draw the parallel with what we've seen before. And we have a very interesting video here to present for you. It's going to be a super short one, but very informative. And let's take a look. Please.
No lie lasts forever. Truth always triumphs. Now is the time for the truth. We will give you the facts of historical deception of all of humanity. In the year 1992, a 12-year-old environmental activist, Severn Suzuki.
I am fighting for my future. Losing my future is not like losing an election or a few points on the stock market. I am afraid to go out in the sun now because of the holes in our ozone. I am afraid to breathe the air.
The year 2018, a 16-year-old eco-activist, Greta Thunberg.
How dare you! You have stolen my dreams, my childhood, with your empty words. Lie on my generation, sucking hundreds of billions of tons of your CO2.
Interesting, isn't it? An old song written by the Cooks of Lies has been played again after 27 years. So what is the reason for such ardent performances by young eco-activists? In 1989, the Montreal Protocol was signed. The major scarecrow for people was the ozone holes. This scam destroyed the world's refrigeration industry and allowed billions to be made on this swindle. The ozone holes did not disappear, but the pockets swelled with dollars. 97, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted. The main problem is the infamous CO2. Greenhouse gases are now a new commodity. As the total climate finance average in 2019-2020 alone amounted to 632 billion US dollars. A new global scam that is profitable for those cooks in the kitchen of lies. These subhumans exploit children, pleading for sympathy. Aren't you sick of it? To slurp down a stinky broth of lies and pay for it with your hard-earned money. The climate fight today is a big, cruel business. We are forced to toil away for food and shelter and to pay for air. The climate attacks and kills us mercilessly. It spares no one and takes no money. Cataclysms are escalating rapidly, and they are becoming stronger and more synchronized. Let's not be silent any longer. It's time for the truth. It is time to act. Let's bring the whole world together at the Forum on May 7th, 2022.
Thank you so much for showing this video. And the next question I would like to ask Arthur Vitorino regarding this whole craziness that goes around this marketing campaign, which we saw was happening. How come that all the Hollywood celebrities talking so much about CO2, but none of them is actually interested in what's going on with the raising volcanic activity or geothermal activity? Like, what's going on with our society, Arthur?
I like to refer to this as the tragedy of the ironies. It's quite obvious that we're following the money and we're not following the science. This is a huge problem. And there's a lot of money to be made in this, and there's a lot of power to be accrued by following the money and not the science. So stirring up fear, of course, is a great way to govern. I mean, just look at the COVID pandemic. I think this provided us with some very, very, very good lessons. That if you instill fear into people, you can get them to do a lot of things. Take 4, 5, 6 shots of a vaccine that's proven it doesn't work, wear masks that prove that don't work, and yet people are making lots and lots of money off of this by spreading fear and deception. And another irony in all of this is that we're replacing new technologies with old technologies. When you really, really think about it, we're replacing nuclear power plants with windmills. How long have windmills been around in Holland? How the ancient Egyptians of 3,000 years ago used sails to power their boats. They used human power to power their boats. Now we're getting back to that. Here in Florida, we have a tremendous example of a nuclear power plant that was half of it was closed down because it wasn't being used. But then as the area grew here in the Port St. Lucie area, they had to increase the power grid. They had to improve the output. So what did they replace it with? A solar farm. Meanwhile, the power plant still remains half shut. I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous. So we're replacing nuclear power, a very high-tech and well-engineered way to provide energy, with things like solar power. The solar farm here is absolutely ridiculous. When those solar panels go bad, there's going to be a pile of junk that's going to be a mountain in and of itself. And the rare earths, the rare materials that have to go into making that stuff, it's just a total waste of resources as far as I can see. So we're doing this, and to what purpose? Well, again, we're following the money. And it seems to me that a lot of the money has overseas interests. I mean, what countries are mining the rare minerals? Well, we could talk about places like China who are going to profit tremendously off of this. So there's a geopolitical angle to this that also has to be looked at. We're also seeing, again, another tragedy, the ironies, is that, yes, more and more people are being impacted by natural disasters and extreme environmental events. But is that a function of more extreme weather or more extreme environmental responses? Or is it a function of growing populations that are poorly situated? I mean, I think a great example of this is the hurricane that destroyed Galveston back in the early 1900s. I think it was the 1902 Galveston hurricane. They were on a barrier island. They had no hardened infrastructure to mitigate a hurricane. They had no ability to predict it. And yes, tragically, tens of thousands of people died in the hurricane, but they adapted to it. They moved it. It's now called Houston, right? So they simply got up what was left and moved it and became a new city further inland that was less vulnerable to hurricanes. If you look at the data I think are compelling that We have a drop in wildfires, at least in the U.S. and Canada. I've seen that data. We've had a reduction in tornadoes, tornado frequency and tornado intensity. We've had, over the last 100 years, a flattening of hurricane-accumulated cyclone energy. We've actually had a slight reduction of droughts here in the United States. So, also another tragic irony of this is that probably some of the most difficult times in recent human history was during the Little Ice Age. During the Little Ice Age, famine was widespread, and it was very, very well documented by people like Hubert Lamb doing historical climatology, showing that this created tremendous hardships for folks who didn't have access to modern technologies or modern transportation systems so that agricultural product could be moved. So I agree with a lot of what's being said here is that we have to really put our money and our energy into hardening our infrastructure, into adaptive technologies, into trying to improve predictive technologies, and stop following this nonsense of old technologies. Wind and solar are old technologies. Even solar, when you think about it, Middle Eastern cities, the original cities in Damascus, for example, used passive solar energy to cool the buildings. They had very narrow alleyways. They had small windows to minimize the amount of solar that would come in, and they tried to maximize airflow through these urban areas so that it would cool them down. In fact, I did my master's degree at SUNY Albany, which is a very cold environment, and they built it with wind tunnels, which was the stupidest thing in the world. I mean, when it got cold up there, those wind chills on that podium would get down to minus 20, and it looked nice, but again, it was an old technology misapplied. So we've just got to get a lot smarter about this. In terms of putting resources into this, yeah, I've talked about the fact that it's very hard for us to publish in this area. We have been deplatformed. We have been denied access to the frontline publications and all this. I would like to see an objective, scholarly journal with scholarly merit started, where we can get a good, honest discussion about climate and climate change. One that does look at natural drivers, one that is not so focused on CO2, because as far as I'm concerned, as I said, it's greater than zero, but less than statistically significant in terms of the human component of it. Yes, it is a greenhouse gas, but we've contributed very, very little to this. So at some point, we just got to get a lot smarter about this. I think a lot of the money, needs to be definitely redirected, and we definitely need to wrest power from those who are directing the money in some not so good ways.
You asked a question about celebrities, and while in the climate science community and maybe in the media, it's follow the money. I don't know why celebrities do what they do. I can't explain the psychology of that. I don't have the hubris they have to think I know best how the world ought to live. But I will say this. If you want to talk about the tragedy of ironies, that perhaps one of the greatest tragedy of ironies is that the people who argue the most for sacrifice make the least sacrifices themselves. Leonardo DiCaprio flies across the world on private jets to receive awards for his work on climate change, and then to the Academy Awards, and then back to a private island. Al Gore, the sort of Methuselah of climate change, he, through his political connections, starts a television station that he decides with his co-owners to sell. And who does he sell it to? He sells it to Al Jazeera, which is owned by an Arab state that makes its money off oil. They're getting rich. They're continuing to live their lifestyles. The point is, they're not living the lifestyles they say we need to live. When they have these climate conferences, they could do it all. I mean, we're holding a conference right now over the internet. I didn't leave my home. None of you, as far as I can tell, have left your homes. We're all sitting and we're all talking. They have to fly 20,000 diplomats and negotiators and climate activists around the world to fancy locations. They never stay in Holiday Inns or Best Westerns. They stay in high-class hotels. They eat very expensive meals that are shipped in from all over the world. They don't eat local. They don't eat vegan. They don't live the lifestyles they say we need to live. And that, I think that's pretty telling. If you really believe what you're saying, show me by example. Don't tell me to do what you say. Tell me to do what you do. And if what you do is not representative of what you say we all have to do, I don't trust them.
I'll make a broader comment about, like the way I look at it is we're not going to torque the mainstream, the mainstream science institutions, the mainstream media, even government. We just need to figure out how we strengthen these alternative institutions. And at least in the US, there's a very interesting story playing out right now. There's a podcaster by the name of Joe Rogan, who has probably one of the biggest audience, well, certainly the biggest audience in the US of like 50 million viewers. I mean, this is, huge, bigger than, Fox News and CNN and all that other stuff combined. And he just wants to have honest discussions and explore the alternatives and understand all these contentious issues. And, and he recently had Steve Koonin on his show, who's a physicist who wrote a book called Unsettled about climate science. It's a very good book. And he was on the Joe Rogan show, with, 11 million viewers or something like that. So I think that is possible to, bypass the traditional infrastructures and organizations and stuff like that to do something really important, which, Creative Society's trying to do, and each of us are doing in our own little way, having an impact. But I think we need more diversity of voices out there. Even though we generally, in this little group, seem to see things in similar ways, not everybody sees the problem in this way. There's a whole bunch of individual and cultural reasons that people think in different ways and value things differently. And let's allow this proliferation of ideas and discussions and values to occur. And then we try to come up with solutions, that makes sense in a broad context. So I think we need to abandon solutions that are based on a robust climate science, because at the end of the day, we can't predict the future and we should just abandon that. But we need to come up with robustness of the policies that make sense in context of a wide range of values and in context of a wide range of weather and climate outcomes. And that's what we should be seeking to do, and just allow the proliferation to occur. We're not going to take over the mainstream institutions, but we need to ensure that alternative perspectives have a voice and are heard, and we should seek abandon trying to make the science perfect and robust. I mean, the Earth system's too complex for that. It ain't going to happen in any of our lifetimes. And try to focus on robust solutions, across a range of things, energy, water, food, agriculture, security, whatever the big issues of the day, there is a climate component to that. So we can make climate-informed decisions, but we need more of a decentralized approach, bottom up at the national and the regional level. And we need to allow a diversity of voices to be heard. So that's the way I look at the issue. We're not going to change the establishment or the mainstream. We just, need to focus on changing our mindset so that a wider variety of voices are heard and a wider variety of policy options are considered.
Да, спасибо огромное, Джудит. И спасибо всем участникам. Я получаю огромное удовольствие от этого круглого стола.
Thanks so much to Judith and to everyone. I'm having a bit much pleasure from this round table and from this discussion. We are representing creative society, and this is whole humanity. We are millions all over the world, and we're looking at all the things with sober eye. And all hopes is on you, on scientists, climate scientists, physicists, chemists, geologists, astrophysicists. Without you, we won't be able to understand what awaits us ahead when we're gonna consolidate and bring our efforts together, when we're gonna make a brainstorming. We will be able to identify risks, and we will be able to understand how we stand climate cataclysms and what affects the growth of geothermal heat flux, what affects activity, volcanic and seismic activity. And the first thing in a creative society and in a transition stage, what will be done is to stop climate change in this strong form, in this strong manifestation which kills millions of people. And we need smart heads, we need smart people who works on the same wave, who thinks at the same page and works at the same goal to save life of each person. And for this we need to comprehensively study all the causes of climate change. For that we need to unite smartest people from all over the world who will come out and say the true things, what is really going on with the climate, together with participants of creative society. And we need to explain this to people. This doesn't make sense to explain something to politicians. They perceive only something when it's put on their table. They are not physicists, not scientists, not climatologists. They are just politicians. But when people, together with scientists, will explain it, politicians won't go anywhere. And we believe that all true, honest scientists need to unite from all over the world and to notify all people of the planet that the climate is changing, not because of CO2. There are other reasons for that, to put out this information to politicians as well, and to start funding the real scientists. And we can't make it in a consumer format, and exactly that's why we need to change it to creative formats, so the scientists would have no financial limits. There should be no limits for studying the true cause of climate change, and these billions of dollars which have been spent God knows where and disappear in someone else's pockets. It should be spent on what's something that whole humanity needs. Today, author and each speaker was talking about this. We need to understand the true cause of climate change, to expose these lies about CO2, to demand the report from the government where the money was spent, why there is no effect, and to offer another way, to unite scientists and stop lying and fooling people, and to start actually address these issues, why seismic activity is growing, while volcanic activity is growing, magnetic field is weakening, why cosmic rays are getting stronger, why earthquakes are rising at a greater depth. And we cannot waste this time, because this time means losing human lives. In the creative society, the unification of scientists, it will be a forefront, and climate change is intensifies, and we need to forecast all the risks. And we understand that climate is the only enemy of ours, and that's why on the May 7th, 2022, will take place International Forum, Global Crisis, We Are People, We Want to Live. It's being organized by independent unification of people from more than 180 countries on the platform of Creative Society, and the live broadcast will take place on thousands of media channels with simultaneous interpreting into 100 languages. Please share this information that this forum will take place. Already now we are publishing trailers and videos about this forum. We raise the topics of which each person needs to know about. Please join us with active spreading of this information, because it really concerns everyone. And if you are scientists, please join us so we would be able to create faster this core of scientists which will stand in the forefront of the battle against climate and to find the true cause of climate change. Please become the scientists who will save all humankind, and people from all over the world will support you, because we are people and we want to live. A huge thanks to each speaker today.
Our dear experts and scientists, it was a real pleasure to have all of you today, and thanks a lot for really thoughtful and brilliant discussion. And for me, the major points to take away was that, first of all, we do observe considerable changes, and we have kind of two separate problems. One is the carbon dioxide, and another one, it is a rising extreme events, and these are two separate problems. And what we should address, first of all, it is this adaptation program. It is how we should adapt and how to use resources wisely in order to avoid losses of people, and in order to have and to focus on human well-beings. And it is really great pleasure to hear all your opinions, and I would like to thank all of you, and it's a real honor to be here with all of you.
Thank you, Anastasia.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for having us on. A very, very important discussion.